I'm Richard Gold with Stewards of Change, and I'm the moderator of the exciting panel dealing with confidentiality. Those two words are rarely heard together. It's so exciting. It's Wednesday. It's put on Wednesday morning agenda of a 3-day seminar. So just remember that they saved the best to last. We do have an exciting panel. I'm going to break precedent a little bit as a moderator and do a little bit more talking than others. I want to remind you of some of the last 2 days and what people said about confidentiality. The damning remarks about lawyers that were said. Several of us are lawyers. Several of us have only married lawyers. Some of our best friends and relatives are lawyers, let alone judges, which is even worse than being a lawyer. No offense, Judge. No, you're supposed to say no offense taken, Richard.
No, you're in contempt.
The dreaded words. This is all on film, and I will see everyone who clapped afterwards. So I just want to remind you and go back a little bit about what was said in the last 2 days. We began with Nick Jones and Stephanie Reel talking about they're looking for outcomes, not outputs, and things that are measured, person-centered, and the big word is change. Change is hard, but if we build it together step by step, we can do it. Daniel then did the 10 interoperable steps and guides, and confidentiality appeared. It's one of the interoperable drivers, but it also has to be consumer-centric. Assistant Secretary Sheldon talked about changing mindsets, and that the mindset is the barrier to this change, and how we have to move away from information belonging to one person or one system and really looking at how to share information to improve outcomes. Assistant Secretary Sheldon was the first one who brought up Shakespeare's famous lines about lawyers. It's one of those lines that's misquoted constantly. But he talked about joining ACF and having 400 lawyers and finding 400 lawyers who in unison said no. And really finding lawyers to help you succeed in sharing information and not stop you from succeeding in sharing information. And we have some of those lawyers on the panel this morning. Julie Bown, I hope I said her name right, talked about harmonizing security efforts and not tearing down security efforts, but really seeing how we blend them. She also brought up a great story about the person asking the wrong question and getting the wrong answer. Do I have to take personal time for the picnic? And she said, now that you've asked, I have to answer, but I wish you hadn't asked in the first place. So sometimes it's the question that's wrong, and you get the wrong answer because the question's the wrong question. So, you as executives or as the boss asking lawyers to help, maybe sometimes we have to look at what questions are asked as opposed to the answers that you get. Jessica Shaheen talked about the nutrition program having all this information about households. And I'm a die-hard child welfare person, and I'm proud to say that. But when I heard that, I thought of the hotline worker who gets a call at 2 o'clock in the morning and has to do an investigation in a house for a child who may be being abused. If that person could just get before going out on that investigation the household composition that probably the food stamp, the SNAP people have. Before knocking on that door, it would just be one more tool for them to really know how to do a job. And seeing how the food stamp people could help the child welfare caseworker by just maybe pushing a button. Joe Bodmer talked about data analytics on top of a data warehouse, a no wrong door approach, and the service-oriented architecture, and how integration is the way to go, and that you're insane if you do it otherwise. Then someone who wasn't on the panel, so I won't say her name, but her title is Director of Integration, said maybe it should be incineration as opposed to integration. And it brought a tone to the 3 days. Did you like that comment, Shel? Okay. And how Joe talked about that there'll be steering committees created on interoperability, and that he hopes that people join those steering committees. Henry Chow talked about separating belief from fact and likes and dislikes from fact when talking about what information can be shared. Another interesting exercise that we all have to go through. Can we share it, or is it more we don't want to share it? So it's back to the third grade mentality of playing in the playground. In his reflections on at day 2, Daniel again brought up the dreaded lawyers and having them be part of the solution and not representing the problem. That's as a former government attorney for almost 10 years for the City of Brotherly Love, which is Philadelphia, not Baltimore. And I always viewed myself as part of the solution and not part of the problem. Because those were the days when we began hearing about something called AIDS and this phenomenon on the street called crack, where we just thought we beat heroin with methadone. We now had this new thing called crack cocaine, which you could buy for $5. And you could buy it on any street corner, sadly, in Philadelphia and probably every other urban and then non-urban center in the United States. So our prison population grew tremendously, and our social problems grew exponentially. And our silos grew stronger, not weaker. So our infrastructures were again separate and apart, and everyone had information, and there was no information being shared. So Olivia Golden talked about large-scale innovation being very difficult, and that complexity requires a culture of learning. And I love that expression, a culture of learning. And that regardless of how complex it is, it's a process that we begin and we can end successfully. Secretary Hazel then talked about the solution not just being technology, but also building partnerships. Someone said to me, well, how do you share information? And I said, well, it's easy, just have the court order it. And the person said, well, our judge doesn't want to do that, doesn't feel they have the jurisdiction to order it. And I said, then you're back to the hard work of meeting and building trust. And building trust takes time. and it's not an easy process. And again, we have panelists that's really going to talk about that complex process. Carrie Hoff, who did a great job in talking about San Diego. I don't know, is Carrie here? No, and neither is Nick. I wanted to praise her in front of Nick, so I lost both. But it's on tape, and we'll send it to her for Christmas. Really creating an accountability care community. Not just working with people in one system or another, but the entire community of San Diego. Bill O'Leary talked about medical homes and how medical homes could also be places where we coordinate health and human services and be the storage of that information. An interesting concept of taking the medical home and going several steps forward. Martin Dugan, of course, then talked about the massacre of lawyers by Quorum IBM, going to Ontario and firing 2 full sets of attorneys who kept saying no. Of course, then later, Martin, when we did the headlines, I thought of a headline, Ontario Massacre of Lawyers. Martin Dugan arrested. No, that wasn't. I was just fantasizing. I won't go into any further of my fantasies. Until he found that third group. But I wonder if it really wasn't your reflection, Martin, that you changed the question from not whether the governments could share information, but now you were asking that third group, how do we share the information? Not yes or no, but tell me how. Walt then talked about moving away from transaction-based systems and program-based systems to people-based systems. Then we went into the fishbowl, where one of the reflections by Kathy Fallon of PCG, she didn't think I was listening, but of course I was, she talked about even once you share information and have it available, how there's resistance by social workers and line workers to use the information and the data to help them. And I talked to some other jurisdictions who've built some beautiful systems of having information available, and I said, do the child welfare workers use it? And the answer is not at all. And so it's not just having it available, but really teaching a new way of doing our work. So I'm here to say that I have read almost every federal health and human service law there is in the last year. I did seek psychiatric help during that reading and got it. And I'm here to say I didn't read any law or regulation that said information cannot be shared. There's no ban to information being shared. Instead, it's the hard work, it's the changing the culture. It's figuring out what information do we. Oh, I got a high five from I think Illinois, right? Illinois, they're having a governor's convention in which prison? Will that be? Oh, sorry. Joan's sitting there saying he is incorrigible and he will. I know. You tried. You know, she just, and Kathleen's just sitting there going, you either love him or hate him, right? Okay. So it's. It'll be taken out. Don't worry. Right. Trust me, lots taken out. It'll be like those people. Right. It's those people that say I'm in a movie and then you see the movie and you say I didn't see you, and I end up on the floor. Daniel makes sure of that. Okay. But I did wear a blue shirt, and you know, because I know that films well, and I did ask to try to get my good side. Rick Friedman taught me about the good side or the bad side, so getting down to business, how to share information and what information to share. We have a great panel, and I'm just, again, the bios are in the folder, so just let me briefly introduce them. And I, of course, have Ahluwalia, and I think I did it right. I've been practicing did I do it right? Oh, for 3 days, and I've been panicked that that's my first name. Is the Director of Health and Human Services here in the state of Maryland in Montgomery County. And has created a wonderful, really state-of-the-art human service operational system. And one of her goals is not just to have a health and human service system, but to truly break the silos within the system and have one system. And she'll be talking about that. Following will be Larry Bolton, who's counsel to the California Department of Social Service and counsel to the California Office of Systems Integration, giving a legal perspective from a state, followed by Barbara Cohn, the Executive Agency Counsel for the Director of Policy and Legal. I wonder if it's policy and law, or if is it policy and legal?
It's a matter of interpretation.
It's and it's on a need-to-know basis, and she didn't get a consent from me. I understand completely. And to give from a local perspective, but of course that local perspective is New York City. And then, last but not least, John Ruegg, Director of the Los Angeles County Information Systems Advisory Body, to give really a security perspective of data information. So I will give the podium to Uma.
Good morning, everyone. Even if I tried, I couldn't be as irreverent as Richard, so I will stick to the script. I think there is or I can just talk. It's fine either way. Okay, thanks. So as Richard said, I'm the Director of the Department of Health and Human Services for Montgomery County and have been in that role for about 5.5 years. And I'll tell you a little bit about our story in a second, but it is only now, 4.5 years into the work, that things have started to tip, right? It's taken us, and when you hear about San Diego and the 15 years they've been at it, it's taken us, we've been integrated since 1996, so it isn't a new thing. But to actually drive deep into the practice around the whole conversation about integration takes time. And one of the very first things we confronted was confidentiality and privacy, because we have social workers, we have nurses, we have therapists, we have counselors, we have physicians, we have psychiatrists, and every profession teaches their students to value privacy and the ethics of confidentiality. We're also operating in a world where there is a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? There is a lot of pressure with HIPAA and this whole electronic health record to have tighter security. And there are actually penalties happening around breaches and how we respond to breaches. And there is push to integrate and to interoperate. And there is not a consistent federal policy framework that says you can do this and you can do this, and here's why you cannot do that. And there is 42 CFR, there is HIPAA, there's child welfare protections, there's domestic violence protections, there are protections around homelessness. And if you serve all those populations, you have to walk a very, very careful line. And so one of the very first things we had to tackle was confidentiality and privacy. And it took us about 18 months with our county attorney, and I was very, very fortunate at that time to have a county attorney who got it. He's no longer with us now. He's at the federal government. But one of the first things he did when I met with him, I co-opted just about every director who starts, right, around the time when, or after me, and take them out to lunch and say, here's what I need, and here's why. And so usually it works. And he was terrific. And I told him what we were trying to do. And I said, we've been having a really hard time of it, and can you help? And he directed us folks to say, okay, we know what the end game is, try to figure out how to get there. And how to get there in a way that keeps them compliant. And that's what we did. We had some early breakthroughs after 18 months, and then we've stopped. And really what we need to do is we figured out the framework for within the department with a lot of workarounds for the statutes that are really problematic. But we're hopeful now the next phase of work is beginning where we're going to bring in our nonprofits. Because if you really want to do teaming and integrated case practice, the nonprofits need to be sitting with us, because a third of our dollars are sitting out in the private sector, and we have to figure out how can we bring them to the table. We do bring them now, but it's an individual consent each time, and we'd like to build a framework where we can have that same approach like we do with our public sector enterprise. Okay, having said that, I am going to now, I'll come back to the slide in a second. Actually, let me do this. What you see in the center, those are our three sort of overarching goals for the department: safety and risk mitigation, health and well-being, and self-sufficiency. That pretty much drives our work, and we actually have outcomes, whether it's, whether you look at safety from a domestic violence perspective, or you look at safety from a child protection perspective, or you're looking at safety and risk of falls, all of that, we roll that up overall into that safety bucket. Each of our programs fit into one of these three buckets, even though they are vastly different. Same with health and well-being, between mental health, infants and toddlers, substance abuse treatment, all of it. And then our whole continuum of public health services, and then self-sufficiency, which could be the ability of a senior or a person with disability to live alone, or it could be economic self-sufficiency. So we've taken a very broad sort of because we have over 129 programs in our department, we can't live with 150 metrics. No matter what you say about analytics, it doesn't mean much when you live with that. We have to be able to tell our story more concisely. So I'll come back to this slide in a second. Let me tell you a little bit about our community. In the 2010 census, we were just shy of 1 million residents in Montgomery County. We're a suburb of Washington, D.C., largely seen as a bedroom community for the federal government agencies, but we have, and some of you may have heard of communities like the Potomac and Bethesda, which are very, very wealthy neighborhoods, but we've had a very significant demographic shift. Our community is more brown, and it's poorer. And as you can see, 31% of our population is foreign-born now. Over 50% of our population is ethnic minority. So this is not the bedroom community of 2000 and before, where most of the people were Caucasian, were wealthier, and it has been a huge shift for us in terms of how we recalibrate the way we serve the people who are coming in our doors. And how do we see diversity as an opportunity? And this is something that requires a huge amount of conversation that I think many of us are having in our communities. Diversity is a tremendous opportunity. I see myself as one of those immigrants who's come to this country and been successful, and so I get it, right? But how do you create those opportunities? Over 40,000, we have a school system of about 145,000. I think in September it's going to grow. Over a third of that population now is free and reduced meals eligible, and of that, 73% is free meals. This is larger than the entire school district of the District of Columbia, the public school district. population. So that begins to tell a story of poverty that we don't successfully tell in the state. We really struggle because we're still perceived as wealthy and able to manage with fewer resources. We're also expecting a 17% growth in our senior population, and a lot of conversation about what does that senior economy look like, what does it mean to maintain the ability of seniors to age in the community, and many of them are multi-generational families taking care of grandkids, and so it brings the child welfare piece in. There's a lot of overlap. About 5 years ago, the school system, when I started actually, the superintendent came to me, this was a dream come true, it doesn't happen often, came to me and said, we want to work on the educational achievement gap. Will you work with us to address all those social determinants that impact that achievement gap? And so when we talked to the school principals, we were delighted. We threw our doors open, and it's still taking 5 years to have all the impact we wanted to have. But we went to the school principals, and they said, our kids are moving. There's a lot of turnover. And so we mapped that against our zip codes where we were getting our emergency assistance data. And guess what? There were these same communities, right? There is a pattern here. You all know this. There's a red zone. You see kids coming into care from there. You see people who are uninsured from there, more domestic violence. There's higher crime. There's poverty. And so we identified these 6 zip codes that we wanted to go work in. And we've been able to get into 3 of the 6. We just haven't had the money to go into it. But if anybody's interested, there's been a fantastic experiment about neighborhood-based work with community organizing and bringing all those pieces together. Anyway, around the same time, my boss asked me when he hired me, he says, what's the value of an integrated department? He's never asked me that question again, so I don't know if he was making conversation or he was actually serious. But I think he was reasonable. I took it to be very serious. I thought it was a mandate, and I took it back to my shop, and after the usual sort of 3 to 6 months of scanning and learning, I said, okay, we're going to start building on what's already been done, and a lot had been done in the department. And so we found that about a third of our residents use about more than 3 services from the department, which sort of makes the biggest case for integration of our practice, not just of our systems, but of our practice. And it's a time when we've had horrible budget cuts. We're not a large agency with huge budgets, about $260-some million when I started, and we lost about $36 million over the last 3 years. So it was pretty catastrophic for us, and we've started to recover this year. We've done a little well for fiscal year 13, the upcoming fiscal year. But we've got a lot of ground to gain, but not in the same way as they kept investing before, right? I have to make a new paradigm around integration for investing differently. Our food stamp caseload has grown by 136%. Our TANF caseload by 74%. Our overall application volume has grown by 42%, but our caseloads have just skyrocketed in our community. And our workers are struggling at a time when we've had hiring freezes and reduced workload. And so integration and eligibility integration and technology becomes one part of the solution for us. All right. So in 1996, 4 county departments became one entity, and the objective was to have integrated, coordinated, comprehensive service delivery. Oh. I'm not sure anybody can read that now. Sorry. It looked a little different, but let me just talk through it. So there's one director. We've centralized all our administrative functions. We're moving towards a single client record, the master client index that everybody hears about. We toured New York City. We went to a bunch of places, and we are building our master client index now. We've developed a uniform intake tool. So if anybody comes in our front door, we ask them about all of our services, and we say, one time, enter your data, tell us what you need. We haven't applied it to all of our 129 programs, but we've applied it in our major eligibility programs and in our major eligibility offices. And so we're asking people up front, they may just come in for food stamps, and then it turns out that they're at risk of becoming homeless, or they're experiencing domestic violence, or something else is happening. And once we have our automated system up, it will be a lot easier to track. Right now we're on a manual referral process that we'll be able to track through the system, the whole triage and referral process and all of that. We're also asking 2 questions that are really critical for us: country of origin and language spoken at home up front, so that we're able to meet their needs in a more effective way, because we have a lot of language access services in our community. People speak over 166 languages. We have about 6 to 7 languages that we think are extremely, that are more urgent, and so we hire into that, and we have lots of interpretation resources. The other good thing that happened when our department was established by charter, by home rule charter, was that the entire HHS was designated as a HIPAA-covered entity. And we threw in social services and income supports, which has been a huge advantage for us as we have been working on our confidentiality and privacy issues. I'm not going to spend a... Is that right? Okay. So our goal, let me see if I can go back 1 second. Okay, something got lost in the transfer. So we'll just go. I did want to tell you the programs that we have in our department, just large umbrella: aging and disability services. We have behavioral health and crisis services. We have children, youth, and family services, which has child welfare, income support, our community and schools initiative, our work with at-risk youth, childcare and early learning is in there. Then we have the whole continuum of public health services, from chronic disease management, disease surveillance, licensing and regulatory affairs, to maternal and child health, just the continuum that you would expect. And then we have homeless services and a whole bucket that does minority health initiatives and community affairs. So when we talk about integrated praxis and the whole issue of confidentiality and privacy, we're trying to figure out a framework that enables, if you have a client, let's say, who's a homeless diabetic, or if you have an immigrant who's pregnant without health insurance, who's experiencing domestic violence, has 2 children under 5, that we're able to come together to case manage around that in a way that permits the sharing of information, the planning, and the service delivery. So we've been working, we have over 50 locations that we're in the community. Those include clinics, those include our offices where we take eligibility applications. And so our goal is that whatever we build technologically will improve access at all of these 50 locations, plus hospital emergency rooms. With the Amtrak-like kiosks for eligibility, we should be there. There's absolutely no reason why we cannot have accessibility and improve, and then take my workers who are eligibility workers and turn them into assisters and connectors and move them into the NGOs. And move them into the community, and we can do real-time scanning of the verifications and do same-day, next-day eligibility. I mean, that's the vision we're working towards. So the key to our experience for our customer will be access to all of our HHS programs in real time, not sequentially, not chronologically, sharing of information and data, and then customers telling their story only once, and the reuse of the data. Some of this, there's already much of the conversation last couple of days about technology that allows us to do all these things. The things that we had to work on early to get our policy framework correctly, the first thing was to define the word treatment. And within treatment, there is an obscure regulation on HIPAA, and we always come back to this, that speaks to related services. And that the definition in our context for our department, those services include social services. It isn't just healthcare when we talk about related services, but in the context of maintaining the health of the client who's at the center of the work. So addressing a client's basic food or shelter greatly impacts the effectiveness of healthcare. So if you had a homeless diabetic and you didn't address the homelessness and the person keeps showing up in the emergency room, that's one outcome, right? But if you address their homelessness with supportive housing, they had a refrigerator where they could keep food, they had a stove where they could prepare healthy foods, they had a medicine cabinet where they could keep medications, they had a medical home where they could go, always know where they're going for their medical care to manage their chronic health condition, you have a different set of outcomes. You really can manage the diabetes and reduce the cost of care on the acute care side. And so this requires this whole conversation, and that's why I love the population health framework from San Diego, and we're following the same track, because if you don't think about this in terms of the community and the population, then you cannot then look at where the savings will show up. The savings rarely show up in our own systems. And so the whole community benefit conversation with our hospitals is a very powerful discussion that needs to happen in every community around where the investments in the community around health and well-being are going to be. And then both the intent of the law and the language in the rulemaking process supports this broad interpretation. At least that's what our attorneys told us, and we love it, so we're staying with it. Let me just, give me 1 second. So these are the tools that we built and also the basic framework that we follow. We issued a revised notice of privacy practices. We have a common authorization form, a single authorization form for our whole enterprise. This took a lot of doing, right, to make a 20-page form into a 2-page document, and then to translate it into 6 different languages, and then to train our entire workforce to know what the content is and how they're going to explain it to all the folks who are walking in our door. I have to say, even as we have the conversation about information sharing, there has to be appropriate attention paid to privacy and to security. Both are extremely important. Nobody sends any client information on the internet now over the email without password protecting it. It just does not happen in our department. And I can tell you, just recently we had a situation where someone accidentally hit the wrong lister and the document went where it didn't need to go, but because it was password protected, it protected us from a breach situation, really did. We have to address the issues of role-based access, and we needed all this figured out before we could start our technology development. Because otherwise, how do you build the role-based access rules in any system that the enterprise system that we're building? Minimum necessary, of course, but you don't need to know anything but what is needed. And then the training, we've invested a lot of time training our workforce. When Daniel and them came a couple years ago to do an assessment, one of the strongest indicators that staff rated us on was confidentiality and privacy. They felt well supported by the department's enterprise around those issues. And this is something newer that's emerged. For over 20 years, we had an ethics panel that did case-based ethics analysis, review and guidance. And then some 10 years ago, it was disbanded. They just couldn't sustain it. Now we have lots of service integration initiatives. We're doing quality service reviews. So we did not want to create a whole new ethics process that would require people to prepare cases and come before a panel and do an analysis. So we are taking I kind of call it like a LexisNexis, taking all the cases from the 20 years and building certain rules, certain guidance about if this happens, respond this way, if this happens, respond this way. And so we're building that database, and then we're convening an ethics panel primarily to respond to questions, policy questions, as opposed to individual case-specific questions. And so we're excited about that. There are lots and lots of, as we're doing service integration, for example, I was telling somebody this story yesterday. One of the early populations, we've been extremely supported by Casey Family Programs, and it's been an absolute godsend in our work. And the early populations we picked were adolescents, because transition age youth, because they span public health, because there are pregnant teenagers, child welfare, our juvenile justice population, and then homeless youth. We have youth who are mentally ill, disabled, developmentally disabled. The whole continuum. So we picked that population because we wanted to demonstrate the value of practice with integration. And what we found was often school health would refer cases into the team of pregnant teenagers, but their caseloads were too high. The school health room nurse had probably 400 kids, that she was responsible for. There was no way she could case manage. And so we want to integrate, but who's going to get the lead assignment becomes a big question, right? Who's going to be the lead caseworker? Who's going to drive this? If there is a dispute between child welfare and school health, who's going to win? If child welfare has the force of the court behind them. And so these are all the kinds of practice questions. And so we are close to issuing our practice guidance by the end of this year that will then lay out. We figured out our front door. I say this we figured out our front door. We figured out the deep end, the 80-20. We haven't figured out the middle, where the bulk of my cases and the bulk of my workforce sits. And so to make the paradigm around integration, that's the space that I need to convince. And that's where I have to determine what does integration look like in that middle space. And that's will be our next charge, if you will. But we'll have a lot of the manualizing and the writing of the 80/20 on our front door pretty much completed by the end of this fiscal year. So here's a quick, these are the products we've developed, a confidentiality policy. We've built disclosure charts for purposes of training and reference. We've done the revised notice of privacy practices. We have an abridged version of our privacy practices for signature purposes. We have a staff guide to notice of privacy practices. We have a service integration policy that we've issued. There's an HHS staff guide for sharing client information for treatment. Client rights related to information sharing. We spend a lot of time because we have what's called an opt-out policy. So clients have to actually ask to be opted out of the sharing. So we tell them they have this option and there's a form if they want to, but it enables us to keep good 90% in the mix. And then we're building our integrated case practice framework and then the role-based access form and instruction sheet that we have for our staff. Even with all of this, HIPAA's easy. HIPAA's not the problem. The bigger challenges are with 42 CFR. The bigger challenges sometimes are with making sure that the domestic violence protections are maintained and that the homeless protections are maintained. And so with APHSA, we actually have gone with DC, and Deborah's sitting over here. We've gone to ACF. We got a wonderful reception from Mark Greenberg and Assistant Secretary Sheldon, and the ASPE now, the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, is looking at our draft paper. And they've promised to give us guidance by sometime this year, in the late fall of this year. So we're excited. I think that will greatly inform the field. It is incredibly urgent. We did have SAMS at the table, but it was harder, honestly, to engage on this issue. They believed that the statute gave us all enough permission to do what we needed to do, and we have struggled. I don't know if you have the same experience, but we have struggled with 42 CFR somewhat. And I know that Stewards is working on a confidentiality toolkit, so that should be coming as well soon. So we do have a risk manager in our office, and I think I turn her hair gray every day with the new situations that I present to her. But it's definitely been one of the critical linchpins to move integration forward for us in our department. So thank you.
I heartily recommend everyone looking at Montgomery County, Maryland's privacy and notice of privacy. It truly is a model to be used in integrated systems. And Uma and her staff have really worked very hard and succeeded in helping other jurisdictions through their process. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Larry Bolton to give a state perspective from a legal, or from a lawyer, and Daniel's doing time, which is frightening.
Yes, 15 minutes and 54 seconds from three speakers. So I'm one of the dreaded lawyers. I'll try to, I'll summarize a bit and try to tighten things up. I'm the counsel to the, have been for the last 20 years, to the State Department of Social Services and the Health and Human Services Agency in California, which oversees most of the departments that provide health, welfare, child welfare, human services in California. I'm also a member of our state Supreme Court's Blue Ribbon Commission on Foster Care. This is an entity that where I first became aware of how serious this problem of information sharing and the role the attorneys play in it about 5-6 years ago. Joan Ohl, who many of you know well at the federal government, got the Pew Commission to start funding court social worker interface issues, and as a result, our Chief Justice set up a Blue Ribbon Commission of judges and folks that worked in the child welfare area. And while it was there talking to a judge, I realized they were building an information system for the courts at the same time that we were updating our child welfare information system. And we had done an excellent job of maintaining absolutely no contact with each other and building them in complete silos to guarantee that in no way could we share information or work effectively with each other. Fortunately, we ended up drafting a resolution that was adopted by the Blue Ribbon Commission, which encouraged the two systems to be developed together to interact with each other, consistent with the confidentiality and privacy laws, and also went on to encourage sharing of information among the various partner agencies involved with child welfare. Subsequently, we enacted a Child Welfare Council in California, and that group will be on Friday of this week voting to adopt a new stronger policy on information and data sharing, confidentiality and privacy for all of the departments and state, local that work involved with the child welfare area. And I think it very much encourages the departments to share when it's in the best interest of the children. I'll give a couple of examples that I've encountered in my career, and I'm not going to name names of the entities that both within California and across the country because I want to protect the guilty here. But one of the areas that I was at a national conference that I was speaking at, California and a large urban eastern state both adopted confidentiality laws when AIDS first came on the scene, which were very strong and appropriate laws. I use this as an example of how interpretations can vary because the laws were almost identical, yet in the eastern state, the interpretation was that when a mom that was HIV positive gave birth to a child who was also HIV positive, and then the mother died of AIDS, child goes into foster care, that it would be a violation of the mother's confidentiality to tell the foster parents that the child had AIDS. And as a result, they kept that confidential, and the foster parents weren't given that information. In California, we had, as I said, almost an identical statute. We interpreted it to allow, not just allow, but require that we give that information to the foster parents, that they be covered by the confidentiality laws and not allowed to share it except as need be with medical personnel, et cetera. But I use it as an example of how, when you balance the interests of the dead mother's confidentiality versus the live child's right to hopefully get the most appropriate medical treatment, et cetera. Lawyers can differ, and I think that we sometimes need to let the lawyers know that we aren't just asking for their legal opinion in a vacuum. We're asking for their help in finding a solution to a problem and let them know what answer we would like to get. You certainly want to get objective legal advice, but you also want the lawyers to be on the team and trying to help you get to the goal of providing the best services you can. Lawyers are taught in law school and ethically are obligated to view their clients as someone with whom they have a fiduciary responsibility, and you want to protect from liability. However, we need to stress also that the lawyers need to focus on why the programs were enacted and provide the best possible services to the recipients, not just protect the agency from liability, because the easiest answer to give to any confidentiality question is always, no, don't share it, But that's not always certainly the best thing. I give as one example, and this happened in California, and it's still an ongoing problem. In one of our larger school districts, one of the attorneys for the school district has determined that it would be a federal law violation, a violation of FERPA, the Federal Privacy Education Law, to share information out of education files with either the foster parent or with the child's social worker who filters information for the court without a case-by-case individual court order, which is extremely time-consuming and difficult to obtain. We don't need it in any other county, but in this particular county, the school district attorney is concerned about liability for their educational funding under FERPA. I sent an email to my counterparts everywhere in the country and asked if anybody had a penny of education money withheld for sharing information with the foster care system, and the answer was no. But nonetheless, this school district how many years have they been fighting this? They've had court orders after court order. They've had blanket court orders from the presiding judge, and they still won't share the information. I think this... I'm not using names, Judge Nash. You're editing that out, of course. But again, it's an example where if the attorneys were told we need to focus on how are the children best served. I mean, the concept of being a foster parent or a social worker overseeing a case where you don't know whether your kid is playing hooky or flunking out or whatever is certainly not, from my perspective, consistent with what Congress had intended when they enacted FERPA. Another example, not directly related to confidentiality, another county in Los Angeles, again concerned by the attorneys about liability, they determined that since foster parents weren't legally responsible for paying library fines for foster kids, and the county had no appropriation, the solution there was to prohibit foster children from getting library cards, which I can't think of a worse solution to a problem. And when the director of that county, I'm not mentioning the county, Judge Nash, but let me know. I wouldn't either. But when the director let me know, I said, well, this might be one of those times when you ask county council to maybe re-examine, and lo and behold, they found a way that maybe after a kid accumulated X amount of fines, you might pull that kid's library card, but not prohibit all foster children in the county from having access to the libraries. So. Again, in terms of solutions, I think getting the lawyers on board is important. I will mention two things very quickly because I know we're short on time. There is going to be a National Attorney Conference this September sponsored by APHSA. This topic will be on the agenda, and it's going to be in San Diego the week of September 9th. So if you go to the APHSA website, you can get information on that. The other thing, and this is a very encouraging thing, I think, is Congress has asked the GAO to do a study and make recommendations in this area. And there's the GAO in the back row. And hopefully this will be helpful. I hope the states participate in the survey and let them know where we see problems so that we can make appropriate changes to the federal law. And 7 minutes to go. Go ahead. Thank you.
Just several comments. By the time this session's edited out, it will be good morning to the next session.
Yeah.
Los Angeles seems to have some interesting creative legal opinions. Our good friend Carrie Miller shared that there was an opinion giving confidentiality to computers, that one computer could not talk to the other because of the rights of confidentiality of the machine. Right after the Supreme Court finishes with their decision on ACA, they'll be dealing with confidentiality of machines. Last but not least, how to punish kids. You cannot read library books. That's really effective.
No, they can read them. They just can't check them out.
They can't check them out. You're right. You go to the library and sit quietly and read them. That'll punish you. That's as good as suspending a kid and saying you can't go to school. That one I'll never be able to figure out. From the City of Angels to the city that never sleeps, Barb Cohn from New York City to give a legal perspective about what we heard yesterday about HHS Connect, a little bit from Izzy. It's my pleasure to introduce Barb Cohn.
Thank you. If I tremble, it's just because I'm absolutely shivering right now. Legal issues, abstruse legal boundaries. That pretty much sums up everything. Because the consistent theme throughout is that data sharing is clouded in confusion. And when there is confusion in the face of ambiguity, it gives rise to a culture that's risk averse, the answer being no. Progress and opportunity for improved care and coordination is deferred in lieu of the status quo. In effect, it sanctions an environment of paralysis where information silos are maintained, perpetuating the fragmented and uncoordinated system of care of health and human service delivery. Data exchange in and of itself is neither good or bad. There's no formulaic answer as to whether it is appropriate to share information, and the law itself does not provide an absolute barrier. However, for all interests variously protected under law, they cannot be disregarded. They are respected and safeguarded. For any data exchange, there needs to be regard for its relevance, necessity, and benefit. Law plays a crucial role in the field of health and human services, from defining the power and jurisdiction of health and human service agencies to influencing practice. Why share data? Why exchange information? Information is a strategic asset. It's an extraordinarily valuable asset. It's no longer, as you've heard, whether we should, but now the question is, how do we share data? For the efficient and effective delivery of health and human services, it's a social and economic imperative. It makes possible the highest state of community social health for the greatest number of people. Human service professionals, the frontline caseworkers, doctors, make clinical decisions based upon knowledge and information. Access to relevant, timely, reliable data is of critical importance, ensuring high-quality, effective care. The inability, the reluctance to share information under the guise of privacy comes at a significant cost on very many levels. Unavailability of vital information, difficulty in maintaining continuity of care, inefficient use and waste of resources, and the inability to understand the whole person, individual, family. The consequences of a lack of information range from inconsequential to critical, at times even fatal. Tragedy is usually the catalyst for change, but we can't afford to wait. The health and well-being of our citizens are not expendable. There's a significant confluence of public purposes and goals shared across health and human services. The overlap in public programs and services for clients with multiple needs leaves an acute demand for cross-program client data. Different service systems may be simultaneously or sequentially serving the same clients without knowledge, coordination, or continuity of service. Cross-system data exchange recognizes human problems and issues are not a series of discrete conditions. They don't each occupy their own silo. Real people's problems don't fit neatly into compartments. They spill over programmatic lines and bureaucratic procedures. Real life is complex. Real life's nuanced. Information held by the public sector is central to its ability to deliver high-quality, effective services. We need to change the paradigm from the all too often seeing people only at crisis, when symptoms are treated first, the cost of intervention the highest, and the sustainability and efficacy frequently low. We need to do better, and now, and we need to do better, and we are. Creating the solution, HHS Connect in New York City. With data protection and security as our overarching priorities, the goal of HHS Connect is to break information silos to facilitate effective and efficient health and human service information exchange using the latest technology in a secure environment among disparate human service agencies and their partners, and in accordance with all applicable laws and regulations. The course of history can change. We've all seen what's happened in the world over the last year or two. Governments overthrown, revolutions started, and a lot of it's been facilitated via Twitter and Facebook, social media. Yet a neglected child or an abused child may suffer an ultimate dire consequence because a critical piece of the information puzzle was locked in another agency's information silo. Should we not be able to enhance and ensure the safety and well-being of our children and families and our citizens in real time? The solutions framework, governance, and I can't overemphasize enough the governance. For the interoperable solutions to be successful, it is absolutely critical, absolutely essential to implement a strong governance structure and process. It provides executive direction and oversight for all policy, all legal, all security, all operational issues related to data sharing. especially where organizational and cultural norms are being re-engineered and transformed. In New York City, the way we structure the governance, a roadmap was first issued that defined clearly the strategy, and it also set forth the goals of the collaboration. Secondly, Mayor Bloomberg issued an executive order that spoke to facilitating data exchange in accordance with all laws and regulations. After which, one of the most important tasks that was undertaken was, under the leadership of Deputy Mayor Linda Gibbs for Health and Human Services, an executive steering committee was created and established. It meets regularly, only the commissioners of the Health and Human Service agencies and our partners, and it oversees all the development and the initiatives of HHS Connect. In addition, several work group and subcommittees were established, a cross-agency policy and legal work group, as well as a security work group. The goal of the policy and legal subcommittee was to facilitate the data sharing in accordance with all the governing laws. The effort was undertaken with the optimistic view that all legal issues and policy issues are solvable, that perceived obstacles could be overcome, and that legal and policy analysis could challenge entrenched thinking by unearthing helpful provisions, offering new applications and interpretations of existing laws and already known provisions. The Work at Connect initiative was undertaken with the overarching foundational requirement: access to information is only granted in compliance with all applicable laws. They cannot, and for all interests variously protected, they cannot be disregarded, they are safeguarded. Most critical and most important to facilitating the data exchange is data protection, ensuring a secure environment for the exchange of that information. What is Work at Connect? Work at Connect is a secure, web-based application, read-only, that enables authorized city employees to access a limited set of information from multiple data sources through one point of entry. The data sources that we currently have, we have 5. We have ACS, which is our Administration for Children's Services, child care information, homeless information we have senior citizen rent income exemption information. We have our public housing tenant information. We have various information for food stamps, public assistance, Medicaid status, and select client documents. Access is granted only to authorized users that have been approved by the data agencies, those 5 sources, the agencies council in consult with our law department, and our system is flexible enough. Our security filters, we could filter by program. So if you're not allowed to see, for instance, homeless services, you don't see homeless services. We could also filter by data element. So for instance, if there are 50 data elements available, you can't see 2 of those, it's not all or nothing. We could filter by those 2 data elements, and you could see the rest of the data. The flexibility of the security makes it incredibly powerful tool. So it's not all or nothing. It also makes it an incredibly powerful tool that we could do very discrete sharing of information in accordance with all the governing authority. Work Connect's not a database. It's not accessible to the public. What's not on this? There's a lot not on it. We got it up and running in a fairly short order. The deliberative process for the legal and policy took 12 to 18 months, but in government time, it's been up and running since June 2010. What's not on it, we don't have domestic violence, we don't have HIV, we don't have health, mental health, substance abuse. What we wanted to do is the proof of concept, and we wanted to build the foundational requirements. So now, when we broach those subjects, we have the technology in place, and we have to deal now with the different filtering and security. But the foundational requirements have been built, and now is the next step towards accessing the more complicated information. It's a federated solution. How does it work? If you put in, we have something called the Common Client Index. It's not a golden record, but you take 30 elements, most likely 6 on matching, first name, last name, date of birth, gender, social security number, address, and those agencies feed on a nightly basis from those extracts. If you put in my name, Barb Cohn, I have a history in any of those 5 systems, depending upon how far back we get from the history. That search result will say Barb Cohn, and it might say Administration for Children's Services, Department of Homeless Services, I have food stamps, public assistance. It just says which agencies I've touched. So far, we don't have a database. We just have matched based on 150 matching rules, so we get very few false positives. When the frontline worker sees that's the Barb Cohn I'm looking for, they click on View Details. At that point, it calls out to each of the legacy systems. The agencies, all those data sources, maintain complete control over their data. Again, remember, it's read-only. So it calls out to those agencies, and right in front of me, at that time, in real time, I get to see all the contact information and the history of the contact. So for instance, ACS, DHS, food stamps, I also get to see the household composition. So it's the 6 degrees of separation, all on one screen. So when that child welfare worker gets the call for child abuse, and in New York City, there are 60,000 investigations a year, every single year, that the workers have to go and investigate. They're mandated timeframes, 24 hours to call, 48 hours to make contact, 60 days to complete their investigation and close it. It's very aggressive timeframes. So when they go out, right in front of them, maybe they didn't know a family was in public housing. Maybe they didn't know there were other at-risk children in the household. Maybe they didn't know that there were other adults they didn't know about. So it's incredibly, the frontline workers absolutely, I can't tell you how much they're appreciating this. That's how it works. It's a supplemental tool, I must add. It's not a replacement. A lot of agencies have a lot of tools at their fingertips, but what happens is they have to call, they have to fax, they have to access by phone, and it takes a lot of time to get that information, and when you're on the front line, time's of the essence. This creates in a very user-friendly format right in front of them, and it's basically the demographic information, household composition, but everyone knows in Health and Human Services that information is golden because oftentimes you don't find that information out in sufficient time. Yep. Okay. How did it happen? And I'll cut to the chase. What the attorneys need to know is who's requesting information, what information is being requested, the source of the information, the intended purpose and use of the information, that the data is going to be used for an appropriate use, and the need for the data to accomplish that purpose. It all goes to what are my job functions of that unit, what are my roles and responsibilities. Once all that information is put down in a narrative, and every agency did that, every unit within an agency did that, all the agency councils reviewed each of those narratives, and they took those narratives, they looked at them against their governing authority, and they made determinations. Most important, whatever those legal determinations were, that's how we applied our security. So the legal determinations and analysis was critical in determining who could see what and when, and it was critical, and this is a good entree for the next speaker, into what was the security necessary to accomplish this. And the trust that has been built up, it was very methodical, judicious. I can't stress enough, it's a new area for attorneys, and I think that we built a lot of trust. We were very deferential and respectful, but we did push to say, if someone said you can't share it, we'll say, fine, show me the statute. Oftentimes it's like, oh, we've been doing that for a long time. Well, show me the statute where it's absolutely an absolute bar, there's no exception. And that was the exercise we went through. And over the course of time, the attorneys, everyone's really used to it. They love the process. It's a very, very tight process.
I bring to your attention 2 articles in the primer that would be of interest. The first was written by Ivan Handler on consent as a service. It's an interesting way of looking at consent. And of course, the second one is my article, Confidentiality, Fact or Fiction. It gives a hypothetical, which was really a true case, of a 13-year-old adolescent female in foster care where the education system wasn't communicating with the child welfare system. And this young girl goes through some emotional emotional problems and goes from an A and B student to a truant and flunking out, and the system didn't know about it until after the truancy. And John Ruegg, our next speaker, uses that as a framework for his discussion on security. John?
Well, good morning. I will keep this under 10 minutes, but I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this first slide, the title. I just wanted to say that down in the lower right-hand corner, there's a link to a website. I'll go back. And if you go to this particular website, it's a search tool, and you type in privacy. And there's quite a bit of work that's been done by the Federal Department of Justice under the Global Organization. Judge Capizzi from Montgomery County, a juvenile judge, actually heads the committee and has done a lot of work on information sharing and privacy policies for the juvenile justice community. And they have some good models for writing policies, and I think is what we've seen from some of the earlier speakers. Until you have it written down, until you have the written policies of what information you're going to share and how you are following the particular rules, you can't really go to the next step in terms of actually doing data exchanges. I'm the chair of a group within the global community that addresses security. I'm the chair of the Global Federated ID and Privilege Management Committee. That's rather long-winded, but essentially, as we go through the presentation, you'll get an idea of what that's about. So I would say that what we're going to do in 5 minutes is a lot less, but it's just a little snapshot of some of the work that we've done. So one of the things that are key to any program for information sharing, whether it's in your community, and I should say that I'm the director of an integrated justice system in LA County for the criminal justice community. And I would say that the overlap organizations is with the juvenile courts, the probation department, and certainly within juvenile delinquency we have information sharing going on with our prosecutors and our public defenders that are working with these juveniles, and there's certainly a great need for sharing with the schools, et cetera. But with any kind of program, you need those red-haired champions that have the commitment to say we can and we will find a way to make this sharing for the child possible between all the agencies. So a key ingredient is that you have to develop some written policies. Again, a lot of the speakers who just preceded me have done a lot of that work. It is a prerequisite. You have to train your people, get them educated, et cetera. And then where I'm stepping in here is kind of the last bullet, is development of some of the IT controls for the enforcement of your policies and your security. So the specific committee has a document that I've got another URL on this slide in terms of the organization and the management of writing of different types of policies. And now I'm going to jump into this part, which is the enforcement of those policies. So how do you automate enforcement of privacy policy rules for PII, for the organization, for your organization that collects, it stores? It's got to share this information both internally with other departments as well as with external agencies. And so this, at a very high level, is the technical framework. There's no technology terms and standards, et cetera, that are pointed out in this particular diagram. But basically, it breaks everything down into three pieces. On the left, you have folks that are authorized to access information, whether it's in your organization or it's in other organizations, whether it's private service providers, drug treatment providers, et cetera. You have some group of people that really are authorized to get to a variety of resources. Then in the middle, the kind of the turquoise area, this is where you have those access control rules This is where you automate, you validate that those folks that are trying to access that information are who they are, that they are authorized, they've got the right attributes. And then on the right is your actual information that you're going to share. So there's basically three pieces to this particular orchestration here. I got to stand over here because this thing went blank. So here's the a basic general rule, just like in geometry or math or whatever. Computers always need to have things broken down into specific executable clauses and a vocabulary. So you can permit a particular requester the ability to perform some action on some information for some specific business purpose, subject to one or more conditions and some specific data handling obligations. That's a very generalized kind of formula. So let's put that in some context. Permit a child welfare social worker to obtain a copy, which is the action, on some resource which we are calling electronic school records, and I'll break that down more, for a specific business purpose, which is foster care education services, subject to one or more conditions, and the conditions is where your laws come in. There is either client or guardian consent, or there's a court order, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, whatever your policy rules require. And then what are your obligations as the resource provider when that access comes in, and what are your obligations as the entity that's getting the information? So one of your obligations is to safeguard that information. I could communicate to you, you need to encrypt those records at some particular level. That may be a requirement, a technical requirement by the agencies for safeguarding and keeping your information confidential. And maybe you have a requirement by law to notify the foster parent. So I kind of go ... So there's a series of things that go into a policy. You now have this nice written policy that you can now kind of decompose it into a set of rules. There's a short kind of there's the general rule, but here's kind of a shorthand expression of a rule. Permit requester to perform action on resource for purpose and some obligations if they meet these conditions. And if we just say that, permit the child welfare social worker to get a copy of the school records for foster ed. You must encrypt, you must notify the parent if client consent is obtained, court order on file. Now, client consent obtained or court order on file could very well be a database somewhere. And so whoever's job it is to collect consent and get consent could be storing this in some database. So in terms of an electronic system, the system could go check that database and see, oh, is there a court order here? Is there a consent? If those conditions are met, that goes back into those conditions about whether you are granted, access or not. So here's our requester. Over here on the left is a child welfare social worker, and you can see there's a request message, and in the request there's a place for the action and the resource and the purpose for why they're making that particular access. And if you notice on the bottom, we have something called an electronic identity credential. It's the requester that gets into the technology. You have something when you go get a user ID or you go get a certificate, et cetera, you have some kind of electronic credential that's associated with you that the system used to ensure that you are a social worker, you are a caseworker, et cetera. So that piece of information would be bound to your message as you're making your query to maybe your portal in the other example. And this is an eye chart, and this is the biggest one I'm going to have. But essentially the flow is child welfare worker makes request for electronic court records, and then that turquoise area here, we have what we call a policy enforcement point. It's going to take your action, and under obligations, there's something called obligation services. So maybe there's an obligation if anybody accesses a medical record that you audit that particular thing, so you might have that rule in there. This policy decision point has this electronic privacy policy rules, okay? And that's up in the upper hand right. So each one of those little rules that we did with that example will be a whole set of rules appropriate to the resource and who the requesters are and what your business purposes are. And that's what the kind of the development piece is. And then down on the bottom, if you get through all of the appropriate access rules, then you get access to the record. Kind of the key in this, kind of the takeaway, if you go to the New York example with the portal, and the people are all managing their own resources. So you've got these old legacy systems, and they got all of their rules. Once you actually work out your policy rules for accessing those resources, you can build in the middle a little repository of those rules. So you make the request, they get the data, the rules get applied externally. You don't have to have them go into their systems and change their systems, which they're going to tell you is going to take them 12 months, 14 months, old system, can't modify, yada, 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 right? So you now are externalizing from all those systems these authorization rules so that you can now collectively get access to all these different systems. And you also externalize the people part over here. So typically what happens is you got to get a password and a user ID for 10 or 12 or 13 different systems. In the example of the portal, they've worked that out so that you have one credential. It's a strong credential. I authorize who you are. And then in the background, I've got all the policy rules that can now make the calls to the data. You don't have to have user IDs and passwords to all of those different systems. So basically, you've got to write this down. What are your obligations to share information? And I've been hearing these different examples. Whose job is it to get the consent, for example? Is it the child welfare person's job? If it's their job, then they have a business purpose to fulfill. They're the ones who need to maintain and get that consent into that consent databases, because the other systems are going to depend on that consent being present before they're going to share information. What are the conditions for sharing that information? What are the obligations of your agency? And what are the obligations of the agency you're sharing with the information in terms of safeguarding it, making notifications to others? What are the permitted actions? What are the resources? So coming back here to, I'll move down in the vocabulary a little bit. We're talking about authentication, authorization, and auditing. Authentication just is the process of you as a requester. I can clearly identify that you are a child welfare system, or you're from the school system, or you're from the court, or you're from the foster care system. All that privacy policy rules, your FERPA rules, your, 42 something or other CFR, all these different rules, you've clearly written down for that particular information exchange that maybe that rule governs. You've analyzed that in terms of an access rule. And then you've got your resources. And your resources aren't just general education resources, and I think we were talking about all the way down to the data elements, depending on the requester and the business purpose, which elements you share. But there'll be truancy records, attendance records, counseling, discipline records, grades, for example. It could be very discrete that, in terms of which of those resources you can get access to or not get access to. So I'm going to just leave and close with, this is the overall framework. There's lots of fun technical things that you can talk about in service-oriented architecture. I think you got some talk about that earlier, but I'm sure as an audience, it's more important to understand how you can segregate the resource from who the requester is and define your set of rules. And if you can define those sets of rules, there's numerous ways to implement those rules using the service-oriented architecture, using common vocabulary, setting up portals. There's integration brokers. Then we can get into the buzzwords. There's security assertion markup languages and XACML. It's XML, access control markup language, and HTTPS, and blah, 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 blah. Okay, lots of things that we can get into, but this isn't the place to get into. I think the key is that you, as the agency and resource owners, need a champion for this activity. You do need an organization that brings these agencies together into the same room, and you need to work out specifically for a data exchange, what are the policies that govern it, and you can encode this and write this up in a way that you can hand it to your technical folks to implement in all those latest technical jargon buzzwords. So that's 5 minutes. I did it. So, okay.
Again, it's not whether to share information, but how to share information. And please join me in thanking Uma, Barbara, Larry, and John in giving their examples on how to. Are there any questions? Yes.
One thing that I haven't heard talked about this morning is IRS data and federal tax information. We have gotten very clear messages from the IRS that we're not allowed. I don't know if this is on, but we're not allowed to share federal tax information. If you receive it for the purposes of determining someone's eligibility for Medicaid or advanced premium tax credit, you cannot share that federal tax information with other human service programs, and people cannot even view that. You have to have a very restricted policy about who can even see that information, how it's shared, double safeguards, all sorts of things. So I'm just wondering if any of the panel or you have any comments about that as we try and figure out how to have this integrated human service delivery system, but there are some barriers to overcome as far as what do we do about FTI, because once FTI, always FTI. We've gotten that message loud and clear.
I can comment that my understanding is exactly the same as your understanding, that is the IRS.
Terrifying.
It's what?
It's terrifying.
Because I agree with you, it's terrifying. No, but it is, and they're adamant that is. I will also share with you that I know that there are conversations going on between HHS and IRS and CMS and IRS regarding their position, but it is my understanding that that is their current position. The solution is don't pay your taxes, of course. I don't recommend that. No, don't type that in. And cut. Next question.
In New York City, is there any plans to include other inputs? I don't think I heard you say anything about police records or school records or anything like that, which a lot of times, indicate whether or not something is going on in the household.
Sure. What we've done is we've built the foundation now, and what we'd like to do is start now adding certain sources, as is probably commonplace. Department of Education data is one of the most requested data sources from all of human services, and as is commonly known, we have the attorneys always citing FERPA. I think Judge Nash will actually probably speak to some of this in the next session. But that being said, we're intent on working with the Department of Education for collaborating on opportunities to see how we can interpret those regulations, find within those exceptions. And the beauty of the system that we've built is because of the very granular filter capability. If there's, of all 27 current user groups, if there's only a single user group that needs that information based upon the narrative and the use case that they build, we have the capability to have just that one-off. DOE have that information with that single user group. So the beauty is the technology exists. Now it's a collaboration with Department of Education to find opportunities and have them think more globally than they have been, because there always are exceptions within the law, and how do we work within those?
And I will also say that when I speak to Barb about efforts to share information, she always reminds me, find out, Richard, what you can share, before you deal with what you can't share. And going back to FERPA, you can share what FERPA defines as directory information, as opposed to the information that you cannot share. So there is a whole list of information under FERPA that the law says you can share without a consent. So it might be some of that information is what you need before you go into the really hard part of what you need a consent for. There's a question?
For many organizations now, we're starting to contract out services to people, organizations outside the organization, outside the enterprise. And some of you have talked about, well, we're just getting around. Oma, I know you mentioned we're just going to start bringing in the nonprofits. Could you talk about the challenges why you put that off? And what are the challenges that are being presented to sharing information with these potentially growing body of service providers?
So I'll start, and then anybody else can jump in. I think we have business agreements, business associate agreements with all of our nonprofits. It's a requirement that we put in our contracts, and all of them are required to comply with the business associate agreement. And ultimately, because we're paying the dollars, we say we own the data. So we have the ability to access information. Our issue is when we are sitting in a case planning team and they're invited, often the client is there with us. And so getting the consent is not terribly hard, whether it's in child welfare, you're doing family team meetings, or you're doing a multidisciplinary team in another context. But once you convene the team, they're going to continue on until there is resolution and there is case closure. And right now, we have to seek a consent each time we bring them to the table. And so our goal ultimately is to address, so we started within the department because as an enterprise, we were HIPAA covered and we had certain legally that environment was easier for us to navigate. And already this whole issue is so complex, we said we'll start within the department. And then it took us a while to get all the, sort of the deliverables put together, the training to happen. And I think we're now ready to move in. So it was just a sequencing issue, not so much that it can't be done. And I think that's where we're headed now. So.
And from the New York City perspective, unlike Uma's department, each of the agencies are separate and distinct agencies with separate authorities. So I know my providers are really trustworthy. I'm not sure about, the other agencies' providers. How do I know? They'll be disciplined, there'll be oversight, there'll be not disclosure, et cetera. They're not all on the city, what it's called the password protected. The city has a directory for all city employees, auditing purposes, et cetera. So, but that being said, it's not insurmountable. I think that we'll look at probably maybe in the health area because they're so restrictive, and the subcontractors maybe because they have the HIPAA, they have the business associated agreements, et cetera. It's where we need to go because most of the social services and human services are contracted out. That's where the business of social services takes place from the non-city employees. Okay. But it's a whole little different legal analysis and standard. Again, we don't want to get bogged down, so we'd still be sitting around the table 5 years later talking about and trying to resolve all these. That's why we purposely focused on taking the easier avenues first to build the foundational components. The attorneys now trust us. It's a real strong bond, and they know we're very deferential. And now we're going to ask them to take the next step and look towards the not-for-profit community.
In a previous Stewards of Change symposium, Linda Gibbs, who's the deputy mayor and who's in charge of this whole process, described putting the lawyers in a room and locking the door until there began to be consensus. I'm afraid that if they had done that with the lawyers for the nonprofits, it would be called kidnapping. And so we have to end this session today. With those that still had questions, please ask them of the panel during the next 20-minute break. Please join me in thanking the panel, Uma, Barb, John, and Larry.